And we are live. Hi, guys and girls. I'm very happy to have two guests this time. One is a professor, I think. Yeah, author. Well, they are both authors in different genres. And no, that is great. I really thank you guys for accepting my invitation. And I will let you introduce yourself a little bit, if you don't mind.
Sure. Jay, you want to go first?
Sure. My name's Jay Brennan, or I write under Jason Brennan. I'm the Flanagan Family Professor of Strategy, Economics, Ethics, and Public Policy at Georgetown University. I work on democratic theory. Probably my most famous book is Against Democracy, which is a critique of the information problems that democracies face.
Just one question. Why?
Why what?
Where you get the idea?
Oh,
it's kind of pretty unique. I don't know. Or maybe not. I don't know.
Yeah, I wish there were an awesome story, but for me, I think it was just having a background in economics and political science and seeing the kind of models that they use to describe actual democratic behavior, and then seeing the justifications of democracy that you hear in the popular press or among philosophers, and noticing that these two things don't match.
Okay.
Right? So I thought there's work to be done.
Okay. Sorry for interrupt you. You can continue. Sorry.
That's it. Okay.
Okay.
I guess I'll give my introduction. So my name is Brenton Lengel. I am a playwright. I've had 7 plays produced in New York City. I am also an author of comics and a novel. My most famous stuff to date is North to Maine, the first play ever written about the Appalachian Trail, which I am a 2,000 miler, and I did write that after completing the entire Appalachian Trail from Maine to Georgia. There's also the play/comic series Snow White Zombie Apocalypse, the first issue of which was just released this past October, and the second issue is on its way. I discovered this morning that I have an imitator series, which is very flattering and kind of annoying. And then also I am working with a band called the Crew Shadows. This is their like
great band.
Yeah. And me and the lead singer Rogue and Crew Shadows has beaten out Madonna and Beyonce for the #1 dance hit in the world, actually, in 2005. We are writing a fantasy novel set in the afterlife that begins when the main character dies. I also have a long history as an activist. I was on the ground at Occupy Wall Street. I was arrested at Occupy Wall Street, kneed in the spine by a cop and thrown through a line of motorcycles. Exaggerating slightly, but not really. And I have been, I used to have my radio show Insurrection with Brenton Lengel, which was an anarchist radio show, had anywhere between 100,000 and 1 million listeners, depending upon the episode, worldwide. And I did that for a year before it got too depressing to watch the news every day and come up with something new to be pissed about. So, basically, I'm an artist and sometimes armchair philosopher, and I have spent a decent amount of time in a side career as an activist and journalist. I'm very famous to a certain extent in certain spheres for my anarchist theory. I'm a Buddhist. So all that together, that's me, Brenton Lengel. Hello.
Oh, that's okay. Great introduction. But you, Jay, I don't know. I think you're really humble. I don't know how to say, because you already wrote a lot of stuff. No.
Yeah, I've never been accused of being humble before, so thank you.
Really?
I do have on a stream with me. I'm definitely not humble.
I do have one of the better papers written on the philosophy of modesty that was published back in the day. I've got like 14 or 15 books at this point. I don't really keep track of them. I don't remember, but yeah, I publish about 2 books a year, usually with like Oxford or Princeton or Cambridge University Press. Sometimes they sell well among the lay public. Sometimes they're aimed at only at other specialists. So, yeah,
that's cool.
But that's the job, writing.
Yeah.
Publish or perish. I'm at the point now where I can't perish anymore, but I still publish.
Yeah. For example, that book that you wrote, Against Democracy, how were the reviews? Were like mixed or?
I thought overall they were pretty positive, especially in like the major news outlets. Like the New Yorker had a very sympathetic review. When it was mentioned in like major newspapers, they were fairly sympathetic. Of course, there are people that criticize it. There are people that come after me, but I knew that would happen. The book starts by saying that democracy is the civic religion of most people. They have, when they hear the word democracy, they hear "ha" and like angels singing. And to me, democracy and politics in general is kind of a repugnant way for human beings to live together. And the only reason we should do it is if we can't manage to do something better. So I see democracy as being a tool. It's no more valuable in like it's the same kind of value as this flex tape that I happen to have sitting next to me. There's some junk over here. Like, and if we can find a better tool, we should use it. But for some people, democracy has the sort of role that God has for others, and so just challenge it is just goes deep against their hearts, and then they of course come after you.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that kind of makes sense, actually, because a lot of religion overlaps with political theory. For instance, like the whole concept of the Christian God, the whole concept of going to church is really based upon like medieval Europe. It's a monarchy. If you look at a Catholic church, you've got the rows. It's replicating the medieval court, and the king is up at the front, the priest or God above him, or Jesus. And you'll notice that almost always, the priest and images of Christ have their back to the wall, because, just the very idea that you bow to God or that you kneel is you kneel to the monarch. So, you see human political systems oftentimes are replicating religious ideas, whether it's bowing down to the image of a grandfather, God with a long white beard, or if it's bowing down to the sovereign. And then that creates, as we move into more modern times with republics, that creates a definite dissonance. And I can see how that would be translated into religion, because, again, the Protestants, you look at a Protestant church, it very much resembles a courthouse as opposed to a king. A slight update, with the pastor taking the role of judge and wearing very similar clothing. So, yeah, there's a fundamental problem there where if you have this idea of God as a celestial monarch, that is inherently in contradiction with the idea that democracy is the best possible system, and people who live in a republic tend to think that. So I can see a republic replacing that. So basically, in a very long, drawn-out way, I agree.
Okay, but when you say democracy, you talk about what kind, even direct democracy, I don't know.
Yeah, direct democracy can be useful in certain kinds of contexts, but the basic problem that democracies face is, in most circumstances, your vote doesn't count for very much. And that alters how people behave. So a metaphor for this would be imagine you're in a large class with, say, 1,000 students, and the professor says to you, sorry, I gotta move out of the camera away. The professor says to you that 15 weeks from now, you're going to have a final exam worth 100% of your grade on, say, Biology 101. And because he's an egalitarian, you're all going to get the same grade. He'll average the grade out. Everyone will get exactly the same grade. You won't get your score. You won't get your score. I won't get mine. We'll just all have the average. You'd expect in this circumstance that the average grade would end up being an F, or whatever would be the equivalent failing grade in France or somewhere else. You'd expect people to remain ignorant of the subject, not because they're stupid or incompetent, but because they're incentivized to be that way because their effort doesn't count. If I put in a lot of effort and study, then I still don't get a good grade. I'm dependent upon others. And if I put in no effort, I can just slack off and do other more fun things. This has been confirmed experimentally. When you, in fact, run this as an experiment with real people, in fact, they fail. So democracy has this problem where it spreads power out among the masses, and there are good reasons to want to do that. But at the same time, it incentivizes them to be ignorant and irrational. So we call that, in economics, that's called rational ignorance and rational irrationality. Rational ignorance means people don't know something. The reason they choose not to know it is because the cost of acquiring and retaining that information are higher than the benefits they get from it. And rational irrationality refers to the idea that we are biased, we suffer from certain kinds of cognitive biases, and there's cost and effort to overcoming them, and there's also sometimes benefits to indulging them. People tend to overcome their bias and avoid indulging biases only when the benefits exceed the cost. When you're in a mass collective decision where your input doesn't really make a difference, and that's true of everybody there, they're all incentivized to behave in suboptimal ways.
Can I respond to that, actually?
Sure.
Yeah. Okay. So that's interesting, and I'm getting a lot of what you're talking about. I'd be interested to see the studies that supposedly prove that. Maybe you can link them to me or something. But
yeah, read the book Against Democracy. I cite them. But there's literally 75 years of studies proving that. I am more confident in that claim than I am confident that you're not a robot.
Okay. So my main issue, actually, it doesn't necessarily have to do with that, though. That does fly kind of in the face of a lot of my experience, both as an activist and as a manager. And I've worked as a manager for years. There is definitely truth that when you feel that your vote doesn't matter, there is an incentive to turn off. But I actually want to go back to where you said the professor is an egalitarian, so he gives everyone the same grade. I've spent a lot of time in more egalitarian political circles, and I have never heard that version of egalitarianism ever advanced except as a political straw man by the right to attack the idea of egalitarianism. If you look at, famous egalitarian thinkers, I'll just give as an example off the top of my head, Mikhail Bakunin, none of them, there's a phrase that comes up again and again. This isn't
all right. Jerry Cohen.
Yeah. Hang on.
The greatest Marxist philosopher since Marx. That's his position.
Okay, but I'm not a Marxist.
It doesn't matter because
no. Hang on.
The word egalitarian doesn't matter. You can just say, he says, I'm a schmoopitarian, and therefore I'm giving you all the same grade. I'm not here to debate egalitarianism. The point is just imagine a person gave you that incentive structure, how people might react. It doesn't matter what label you're.
Yeah, nobody actually gives that incentive structure in reality. Now, again, egalitarianism. There's a thing you'll hear from supposed egalitarians is that equality is not sameness, the idea, again, it's. I hear this again and again from the right, and it's the idea that people think the left, and I don't consider myself part of the right or the left, but the idea that the left wants everybody to be the same and everything to be the same, which if you look at these thinkers, it's really not. Now, I've never heard of this Cohen guy. Maybe he's famous among Marxists. I've literally never heard a Marxist ever bring up his name, but if he says that, okay, but I mean, the USSR didn't even do that.
Yeah, it's kind of like that's fine. I'm not trying to pick on egalitarianism when I said that. I just thought here's a particular interpretation of egalitarianism. Yes, there are lots of philosophers who advocate it. Apparently not in your circle, but to me, your comments kind of like if I said Opeth is a black metal band, you're like, no, they're a death metal band, not black metal. That's not really the relevant issue. The issue is just if you had that incentive structure, what would it do to people?
Yeah. So here's my question for you, and maybe we should be sure to define what we mean by egalitarian, by democracy, because you sort of were touching on, I think the quote is usually attributed to Churchill, which is democracy is the worst system of government except for all the others. I mean, is that your position?
I would say that he didn't really advocate that. He said it's often been said that, and it's not clear he actually endorsed that position. But I would say, I'd say of these systems that we tried, of the political systems that we've tried en masse on a large scale, it generally performs better than the alternatives so far. Nevertheless, it has certain systematic flaws. We've been collecting evidence about these flaws since basically 1958, and it's amassing. We have good explanation for why these flaws persist. We have good experimental and archival and other kinds of evidence about what can improve it and what can fix it. And so the main part of the book is just to argue in favor of possible alternatives that might overcome it and why we should be at least open to those in practice. Now, I'm not trying to argue that any of these things are the most just system. I mean, I think if we were all perfectly good, or actually not even perfectly good, if we were all as moral as I am, and I'm not an angel, we would definitely have an anarchist system. I think government is at best, you can say it's a response to persistent injustice. Whether it's even the optimal response, I think, is an open question. I guess I'm around sympathetic ears, but usually people think it's obvious that we need government in light of injustice. I don't think it's quite so obvious.
Can I just make a a practical case, like, for example, now with COVID-19, democracy. What? Because I think this is a special period to, try to test that kind of ideas, like really, for example, in United States now, there's a lot of people that are protesting against the measures of the government, because they have the right to get sick. So I don't know, what is your analysis of the current situation in United States, according to your I don't know, your theory?
You want to take that one first, Jay?
Yeah, the funny thing is, before I talk to you, this is what I was writing about today. So I think in principle, the question of like, can we force people to stay home? Can we force them to do this? In principle, I don't think that's a hard question, because you can use sort of metaphors that illustrate this idea that even though you have the freedom in general to move around and go places, we don't think that that's a completely unconstrained freedom, because you don't have the right to impose undue risk upon others. So if I knew that I were infected with the zombie apocalypse virus from all those horrible movies from the past 20 years, then it would be reasonable for me to think I should stay home. And if I were to walk around being like, I don't care, I'm going to infect other people, you'd be able to say, no, you're imposing an undue risk of harm. So people might think, this is too simple of a metaphor, but I'm not allowed to take a gun and just start shooting it into crowds or shooting in the air when there's a possibility that the bullet might hit somebody. There's limits to how much risk I can impose on others. It's more complicated than that, than just shooting a gun, because people don't know whether they're infected most of the time. There's also the issue of like, if I stay home, someone else might still infect you. So it gets complicated with the collective action problem. But I think in principle, despite that, you can justify mandatory quarantines, mandatory social distancing, even mandatory vaccination. So I have an article in the Journal of Medical Ethics back in 2018 called The Libertarian Defense of Mandatory Vaccination. And it was arguing that libertarian principles plus can be defended on that basis. But all that said, it's one thing to say in principle you can do this to somebody. Like in principle, if we knew that you were a mass murderer and that nothing could ever stop you, then we could use violence against you to stop you. In principle, we could do that. We still have to actually prove the case on any given instance where we try to use power. So my worry about what's happening right now is not the in principle question of whether they can do some of these things. It's have they actually proven their case. So my complaints are things like the models that they're using to estimate the danger are structurally quite poor. They're not up to snuff. Like we spend a lot of time in my field like looking at very sophisticated models that economists come up with that deal with various kinds of parameters, to deal with a problem called endogeneity, which is how people respond to the fact that you're making a policy or that there's new danger, that deal with variance among people. The current models often don't take that into account. The models that were being used to do the shutdown often have a problem where they have in principle something like 700 parameters that can be modified to change the outcome, but governments are making decisions on the basis of an assumption of about 3 of them. So there's issues with the models themselves, and there's also issues with the quality of the data that people are using to make some of these judgments, where one of the first things you learn in statistical modeling is like you can't collect on the dependent variable. So if you're only testing people who come in and present themselves as sick, if that's your primary testing source, like people say I'm sick and I need help, and you test them, then you're going to calculate a certain number of them are going to actually have a virus, a certain number of them are going to be sick, a certain number of them will require hospitalization, a certain number of them will die. But you're not testing at random, you're testing people who are self-selecting, which means that this is not reliable data. You learn this maybe 3 weeks into statistics. But nevertheless, the things you're seeing in the media are using these things to argue, well, our estimate is that 0.9% of people will die. Our estimate is that 3.4% of people die. Our estimate is that 0.7% of people will die. But it's based upon bad data. So I think the best you can say, and my charitable interpretation of what governments have done would be, we look and see what happens in Italy and Madrid and a few other places, and there's a massive number of people getting sick. We're so scared we have to shut everything down just in case it turns out to be the zombie apocalypse virus or something like it. Mm-hmm. But that would at best call for temporary measures while you simultaneously go out and engage in massive amounts of testing for the right kind of thing, like not current illness, but antibodies and so on. And you try to get a proper estimate of what's the actual infection rate, what's the actual infection death rate, like fatality rate, and so on. So most of our governments are not doing that. They're not engaging it. They don't have very good models, and they're not doing the proper data collection. So I think it's a little bit like saying, can you throw somebody in jail? I actually don't believe in jail, but can you throw somebody in jail? I think this is a different question, but could you throw someone in jail if they're guilty? And it's like, oh, right, sure, in principle, but you still have to actually prove that they're guilty. And I think governments around the world have failed to prove that that's guilty in this case. And just to be clear, that doesn't mean I'm a COVID skeptic. Oh, you think it's not really dangerous? I'm like, no, I'm not a COVID skeptic. I am a statistics and methods non-skeptic. I think even in a time of crisis, that those textbooks that we all used and the methods that we all used to publish, those still apply. So I've been complaining kind of.
Maybe the problem is that we don't have actually good data at the moment because it's a new thing.
I mean, the problem. So, first off, as I've watched this thing travel around the world, I've begun to wonder if, judging by what I was hearing in the media and the statistics and how many people die as a result of getting infected, now it may be that I'm misinterpreting the statistics, but it looks to me like the response is very different than what was reported. And in my feeling, I'm sort of wondering if this is actually like a Chernobyl situation, where it's way worse than what anyone's saying. Because really, how quickly you saw the bailouts shoot through Congress, with both parties agreeing to do what has been said. They've told us for years and years and years is absolutely impossible. Bam, done in a matter of weeks. So I have a feeling that the models that we have simply are underestimating the threat. And perhaps even China, being that China is a closed society for the most part, or a more closed society than others, I sort of have the feeling that the statistics they sent out severely underestimate the threat of COVID. Now, I don't want to, scare anybody with it or anything, because, I would like people to take it seriously. What's very interesting about this is that it did have me rethinking a lot of my libertarian anarchist views, because there are a lot of people, who simply won't listen. They reopened the beaches in Florida, despite that there was a movie about this. It was called Jaws. Don't go back. And so it really got me thinking, like, okay, well, do we actually need the state? Do we need governmental authority to shut things down? The problem with that kind of thinking, though, is that, again, it sort of is very Pollyanna about it. You look at the people who are in charge and who are making these decisions to shut things down or open them up. You look at Donald Trump in the White House, you look at the governor of Florida, and you look at how our system has selected leaders from within the population, and you kind of realize these people are idiots. And in fact, it may be that representative democracy, and I have a lot of criticisms of representative democracy. I think a lot will, go with Jay's, just so long as he doesn't become like a dark enlightenment guy or something. I have a lot of issues with this. Is one of the reasons why I support direct democracy. But, the fact is that these systems that we have are not particularly good at finding the best and the brightest and rewarding them with money and power. Oftentimes, people tend to luck into their position, or are born into their position, or find essentially a hack or a loophole that then puts them into the position to, decide the fate of millions and billions. So, it's sort of along the line of, if you can't trust people to do what's right for them, then why can you possibly trust representatives to make the right decision for people on average?
Because I know you both guys, you're from the United States, would like to share with you a little my experience here in France, because it's kind of very different than what is happening there. Mm-hmm. Well, at the beginning, the measures of the government was like just advice, yeah, we recommend people stay at home. Please stay at home. This is kind of a dangerous situation. Well, people in France, they don't really like the government that much. So they didn't do it. And then when the government say, okay, we were going to impose, laws that you will going to... Now I need I need to ask permission to go out to the supermarket. You know, if I get detained and I don't have my document, I will have to pay like 130 euros. So actually, I'm not from France. I'm from Chile.
Oh.
You know, I grew up in dictatorship, so it scared me. It freaked me out a little.
Well, I think the first states, there's a historical case to be made that the first kind of rise of the nation state out of feudalism was in part fueled by the Black Death. By the inability for the decentralized system to take the necessary health measures that needed to be done to combat these various pandemics and diseases. Now, I think the rise of the state is more complicated than that. But, again, the ability to shut down a population, to put into place widespread policy quickly and to enforce that with violence, you can see how that would be very, very useful in a pandemic, so long as it is actually implemented wisely. The problem is, by our structure, can it actually be implemented wisely? Is mainly what I worry about.
But I didn't finish.
Oh, I'm so sorry about that.
No, so we are on that moment right now, and well, so far has been very effective. Normally, in a couple of weeks, we're gonna restart little by little to, the jobs. Not concert, no restaurants for the moment, but we will restart little by little. And what really kind of amazed me because our president, I don't know if you guys know Emmanuel Macron.
Mm-hmm.
He's actually
coverage of the protests and so on over here.
Okay, so actually he's a centrist right guy, but he gave some very, I don't know, all people were surprised with their speech, because he was saying, actually, in their speech, he was minister of economy before in another administration. He was saying there are some things that we can, that basically he was saying that there are some things that are more important than the market. It's like the life of our people is more important. So he stopped everything, knowing the consequence, because he's an economist, and he put in place help from the government to help companies don't go bankrupt. And I was amazed, because I was thinking that was a pretty unique approach, like try to find the balance between have I don't know, he's a capitalist, he's not socialist, not communist at all, but he can see the value, maybe it's not a intrinsic value, I don't know, but he could find the balance between, I don't know, keep the economy running, but people don't die. I don't know.
Yeah. I sort of had a question for Jay about this, because you did sort of hit the nail on the head in the idea that what is more important, people or the economy? Because in the United States, we've had those far right politicians coming on and saying like, oh, I'm willing to die for our way of life. And there's a lot of the joke that I hear on the left a lot of time is like, the market demands blood. It wants your grandparents. So what's your thought on that? On people versus the market? Like what is most important in your mind?
I think the whole framing in my book Against Democracy and a couple of my things, I talk about how people, there's an incredible amount of evidence that people reason very badly about politics, and one of the ways that they reason badly about politics is to demonize the other side, to portray them badly. The analogy I use is to hooligans in soccer or football, people who they know a lot about their sport, but they're biased towards their own team, and they see fans of other teams as evil and so on. So it turns out in politics that for the most part, people think as follows. Like most people who participate in politics, especially, I'm not saying about you in particular, I don't know you, but especially activists, we have a lot of evidence for this. Their reasoning is like, I am obviously good and right. Other people are obviously evil and stupid. So I think when you see the framing, when someone says, oh, is it the economy versus people? It's an example of this kind of framing in a biased way to make it seem as though the other side has to be evil, because really no one actually thinks that way, or very few people do. The question
but people were saying that.
Well, even when they're saying that, what they're not saying like, oh, I want people to die to save the economy. Like, think economists. No economist says people versus the economy. When they say the economy, what they mean is like the structure of cooperation that enables people to have freedom, to have the ability to meet their needs. So when economists talk about, say, efficiency, what do they mean by efficiency? They mean welfare. A system is efficient just in case it's impossible to improve one person's welfare without hurting someone else's. That's what economists mean by efficiency, like welfare. So the question is not people like saving lives. It's rather, of all the various interventions we can put into a place, which will have the overall best effects for human lives, right? Recessions kill people. There are lots of people living in extreme poverty in India and elsewhere who, if you shut down the world economy, this means they starve. For me, shutting down the economy as much as it has means what have I lost? I guess $3,000 in guest speaking or something like that. It's not even like, I was like a discounted rate I gave somebody. So like, whatever, I still have a job, I still eat, I still have guitars, I'm fine. But for some people, this is a life and death measure. When we're talking about shutting down economies, we know things like the 2008 to 2010 recession in the US led to something like 500,000 or what was the actual, I have to look up the actual number, but a huge number of like life years lost because of problems of recession. So it's not as simple as saving lives versus the economy. It's rather, of all the different interventions that we put into place, which will have the overall positive, best beneficial effects. And that's not even good enough, because at the end of the day, we're still saying we're going to sacrifice these people to save these people. Like putting in these things might save grandma, but it might kill some poor kid in India. Right? You care about your grandma. Putting in this thing might save that kid, but it might kill your grandma. How do we decide which one to kill and which one to save?
Yeah, I just give you an example of what we did here. You know, we didn't pick one or the other. You know, here in France we pay a lot of taxes. So instead of use the taxes to go invade Iraq, for example, we use it to help companies to don't bankrupt, to help people that don't have money to survive. So it's not one or the other. The problem with United States, for me, I don't live there. You can tell me that, is that you don't have that choice. There's no your government will not gonna. He will gonna help a lot, like Goldman Sachs or big companies, but the little business, it didn't care. So for me, that's the problem. That what you were saying now is like, yeah, we can choose between hurt people. No one want to want to people to die that lose their job and they get poor and die. No one do that. For me, the problem is really, that I don't know why in America people are so scared of socialism, because in a situation like this one, we here in France we could survive, our economy will survive, because we already have a kind of I don't know how to say it, a blanket, saving
in place.
Yeah. So
I think we can be careful though about. So there's this often a caricature of the U.S. that you see in Europe and elsewhere, which is something like there's extensive wealth. I don't think France is a socialist country. It's more socialist than the U.S., but it's still overall a capitalistic country.
Yes.
But there's often this framing. It's like in Germany and Sweden and Denmark and France, you have an extensive social safety net system and social insurance state, and then in the U.S. you don't. When you actually go and look at transfers per person, like the amount of money spent in terms of welfare transfers per person in the U.S. versus welfare transfers per person in, say, Sweden, it only works out to be about $1,000 less per person in the U.S. So our welfare state is actually really large. We redistribute roughly the same amount of money that you do in the other like Nordic social democracies and so on. The difference really here is about the way the welfare state is structured and who gets targeted. So we have a stronger tendency to redistribute money from not to the genuinely poor, but to older people. Whereas in
older people vote more often.
Yeah. And in some countries, you see more of a everybody gets a little taste of the welfare state. And actually, in the U.S., I wish I had the number. I could call it up. I have a paper somewhere on my computer in front of me that has this. The funny thing that you see is that even like in the middle class, like the average amount of welfare state transfers ends up being something like, a person like the 50th percentile of income in the U.S. gets about $19,000 or so in transfers per year through the government. So we have a pretty extensive welfare state. It's not managed very well. It doesn't necessarily mean because we have to have a cowboy capitalist system. It could just be because we're kind of stupid. Maybe we're too big. There could be a lot of other reasons why it fails. There's evidence if you read like, say, Edward Glaser is an economist at Harvard who writes about this stuff, that welfare systems work better. They're more efficient. They're more effective when you have a smaller scale government than a larger one. It could just be that we're too big to make it work. But it's not over here people are left to die and they don't get welfare, and in France they do. It's actually about the same. It's just distributed slightly differently.
Yeah. I mean, that's an interesting way to look at the issue, though. And again, like the framing in the United States a lot of the time, particularly like you ask why we're so afraid of socialism. I would say that just goes straight back to the Cold War and like the huge amounts of propaganda that I and Jay and a lot of Americans, especially our parents' generation, were just deluged with, because of fear of the USSR and fear of a revolution here at home. Now, what I will say is that the United States does seem to have overall kind of a sink or swim ideology to it. Now, how this works out in practice, we have a lot of stuff that's wasted in welfare simply on means testing. I think a good example is in Florida, they put through a law that you couldn't get welfare if you tested positive for drugs. And so they put in this huge, incredibly expensive program to test absolutely everyone they could who was trying to get welfare for drugs. And what that wound up doing was like costing way more than it would have cost if they just sent out the money and been like, okay, if you're on drugs and getting welfare, I don't care. And I think they found only a tiny fraction of people actually having drugs in their system. So, the United States, there's something that Alan Watts said, and it's one of the things that I object to about the society, and one of the reasons why I hate capitalism and hate the United States, like in this sense. Like, I love where I'm from, I love my home, but this aspect of the United States drives me crazy. And he said that a society that says that everybody must work, everybody must contribute, everyone must belong, is really a society that is insane and unsure of itself. And when a society does that, and when it puts that idea out into, you see this incredible desire for people within the population to turn off. The famous tune in, drop out, get high, because we simply haven't provided an escape for the people who want an escape. So I think that's part of why the United States has a system that is kind of seen as very brutal. And then also, there's no real way to, except for very recently, like every bit of welfare that comes from the government, every bit of money or support, it's always means tested to try to be like, are these people actually contributing? Do they really need it? And it's, in my opinion, a huge waste.
Yeah, I have actually in front of me right now. I looked it up. So here are like the numbers in the U.S. This is from the Congressional Budget Office in 2016. The bottom quintile, bottom 20% of households receive on average $15,000 per year in means-tested transfers, which brings their total income from federal sources up to about $35,000. It drops down to about $7,000 per year to the second quintile. 3,000 per year in the middle quintile, 2,000 per year in the fourth quintile, and 1,000 per year in the highest quintile. But that's only including federal funding. That doesn't include any of the state money that they get. So when you actually put it all together, Americans in the bottom 20%, households in the bottom 20% of income are getting well over $20,000 a year in transfers. So it's not cowboy capitalism. You're left to die. It's extensive.
Without working.
With the transfers, it's probably what it's counting there, and I'm not sure. You can maybe tell me, but I'm going to guess that that's what's counting unemployment insurance, which is why it's stopping at around $15,000, because unemployment insurance, one, you pay into that as you work. Everyone does, if you're working on a W-2, and two, those are usually capped around $13,000 or $15,000 a year.
These are other transfers. This isn't unemployment insurance. I was using this because the paper I was writing where I have this, I was making a distinction actually between social insurance, like you pay into a system and you get something back in virtue of what you pay, versus genuine transfers. So this is just looking at genuine transfers on the basis of poverty.
Mm-hmm.
So they receive that money without working?
Well, it's a variety of different sources, and you might have to qualify in certain ways. Like if you're a single adult male living by yourself, it's pretty difficult for you to get any kind of government subsidies or so on, though you can get them. If you have children, then suddenly it's much easier to get different kinds of welfare assistance and so on. So there often are conditions, though it's not quite the same thing as being, an unemployment insurance or these other kinds of social insurance. My point here is just to say,
like SNAP?
We can talk about which of these things are optimal or not, but the point is just there's a story that Europeans tell themselves, which is the U.S. is like this cowboy capitalist system where like everyone's left to die if they don't get things. And here in Europe, we have all this kind of extensive social insurance and welfare benefits and public goods provided by the state and tax funded. And the reality is the U.S. is just kind of one in the mix. Like on some systems, they're actually incredibly progressive, on others, they're less progressive, but it's just another social democracy. It's not anything special. It is a very extensive state. The state consumes a very large amount of the total gross domestic product. The total amount of money that is spent by all American states is about $7 trillion a year. I mean, it's a gigantic governmental.
I'm not saying that you don't have welfare.
Yeah.
What I'm saying is, in a situation like this, that is an exceptional situation, like a pandemic. It doesn't happen every day. But
we also had a bill passed that's supposed to provide funding to businesses to maintain continuity of salary. It's called the CARES Act. There's the PPP program, and they ran out of money very quickly, but they've been promised another round of money that's coming. So a lot of the programs you have in France, we have versions of. They're not being implemented quite as well, perhaps, but it's not that they're just left to sink. That said,
what do you think about that solution?
Well,
that the government give you money to help your business?
I don't know. It's really complicated.
Are you a socialist?
I live in a socialist commune. So my socialist commune just has 4 people in it. That's all.
Okay.
Is it a commune, or are you just saying you've got roommates?
No, it's a commune. I mean, not all animals are equal. The 2 older and bigger animals have more power than the younger animals in it. But no, I make the point all the time that like almost everyone has a family unit which lives by socialist principles.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, they just don't live on socialist principles on a mass scale, and there are various kinds of reasons for that. But I'm not sure what the optimal kind of welfare redistributive policy is on this. The thing that interests me is just the question of, should governments have done what they've done in the first place? Did we have enough information to make this decision to shut things down? And then when things are not going as badly, and when things are not turning out to be quite as bad as everyone thought they were going to be a month and a half ago, is that because, what we did worked? Or is it because, we didn't really have very good estimates to begin with? And the thing I keep joking about is that if I was reading, I have access to all these medical journals, and I've been reading them and looking at the kinds of models they've been using and the data that they've had and so on. And I make this joke where I'm like, if I were to write an economics paper that used this kind of data and had these kinds of models, and I submitted it to a third-rate journal, it would just get rejected on the basis of it not being very good. But these are this is the basis of the information that governments are making these decisions on, unless, as you were suggesting, they have secret information they're not telling us. I'm not as suspicious of that for a few reasons. When I think about in the past where governments supposedly have secret information, and maybe things are worse than we know. It later turns out they really didn't. They don't have like a good track record if it turns out they knew things that we didn't know, and that's why they were that cautious. But also just because now, even though there should be mass serological testing for antibodies being done by governments, they can estimate the actual danger rates, and very few are doing it. Every time, the University of Southern California does a test, or Stanford does a test, or there were tests done in Denmark, there were tests done in parts of France, and so on. When they go and actually test the prevalence of the disease, they find that somewhere between 5 and 15% of people have already had it as of 3 weeks ago. Which case, these are private actors in the scientific community going out and doing testing, in which case the infection fatality rate goes down quite a bit in terms of our estimates, which means it's probably, as the new evidence comes in that's available to us, it's looking like it's less dangerous than we thought. Now, again, I'm not necessarily saying that we shouldn't have shut things down. I'm just saying, like, we didn't have very good information. And one of the constraints the government faces is when you impose a mass restriction on people's civil liberties, you better have damn good evidence.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you go to the war with the army you have, not the army you want necessarily. I definitely see how the need for better information would be there. But I lived in Manhattan for 10 years. The city, I've never seen the city shut down like it shut down. And not only that, but they were considering using parks as mass graves, and they have done that before in the New York City's history. That's Washington Square Park. If you're ever there, that's actually a giant grave. There's about 5,000 bodies down there from the yellow fever epidemic. So I would say that, like, at least as hard as it hit New York, and New York is unique in that it is 9 million people packed into a small area, living a very intense life, even at the best of times. And, Wuhan in China, that was 12 million, I think. There's this larger city than New York, and I'm not quite sure how packed in it is over how many square miles. But, I mean, these places got hit really, really hard. Now, other states in the United States have not gotten hit as hard because the population is a little more spread out. But just looking at what comes out of New York, and I know someone who lost both their parents to COVID, like, in the last couple of weeks. They're an orphan now, and that was in New York. So, I mean, I think perhaps the response that we've had, even if it was more better safe than sorry, in my opinion. And, like, as long as the government, once this danger is past, releases its control, I don't see a problem with necessarily overcorrecting.
No, I agree. For me, I hate the measure for sure, but if it's not for a long period of time, I'm okay with it. Because you say it very well, better safe than sorry. Because it's a new virus. It's different that, I don't know, there's something that we already knew how it works, or we have all the information, but this time we don't have. We are discovering, how this virus affects different people at different ages and different stages. So I think it's a very complex issue. But I would like to talk with both you guys about, especially because I think we both agree on this, that this could be a very effective excuse for governments to, pass laws to increase surveillance, or it's already, they're already talking here in Europe, ask some companies to have access to our data, to know where you were, if you were with someone that was contagious or not. What you guys think about it?
Yeah, I don't want to put it in conspiratorial terms, because there's this like model of anarchists just think people crave power, love it so much, and they'll just take any excuse to get it. And there are people that crave power, but a lot of the people doing this are just ordinary. I mean, I work in DC. They're my neighbors. They live, like, the people who are doing this live across the street from me. The spies that are spying on you, they live right over there, and they make great hot dogs and stuff. They're nice people. I think it comes down to a couple of different incentive issues that governments face. And so one is, when you're working in the government, you get blamed for the visible stuff that people see. You don't get blamed for the invisible. So, like, for example, this is not a high stakes example, but it's an example. Like, the FDA it takes a lot of time to get drugs approved in the United States. It takes on average about 12 years. It costs an average $1 billion to get a new drug approved. While that drug is going through the process, no one blames the FDA other than a few health economists. No one blames the FDA for the people who die because they didn't get access to drugs, or people who die because the drugs were never approved because no one ever bothered to do them because it's too expensive to even bother go through the testing. So drug loss and drug lag, people are unaware of. It's invisible. You have to go looking for it. But if, on the other hand, the FDA rushes something through and approves a drug, and then lots of people get sick from it, it turns out to cause, like, what was that drug back in the 50s that caused deformities in children in utero. If they approve something and then it's visible damage, they get blamed. So they have an incentive to be overly cautious in terms of health, because the damage that's done from the disease will be visible. The damage that's done from shutdowns will be less visible. The damage that's done from like, if it turns out lots of people get sick, they'll get blamed for it. If it turns out that it ends up not being as dangerous as they thought and people are okay, they won't really get blamed. So governments, you have to think about, if you're a politician and you're trying to appeal to voters, you want to be seen as doing something. That's always the thing. You can't, if you go up and say, this is really complicated, I don't know what to do, people blame you. If you're like, we have to act right now, that's what voters reward you for. And that's true of people in various kinds of agencies and so on. So I think that there are these somewhat perverse incentives that lead to problems over time. And the other thing is just, you have a hammer, like you have your hammer and everything looks like a nail to you. So you work in a particular agency and you think, if we just have power, we could fix this, and then you have an incentive to do that. So I don't think you have to posit that governments are just craving power for the sake of power to think that they might.
No, of course not.
To react in perverse ways.
Yeah, of course not. It's just the way they act. But we can see it with all the evidence that we already have. But for me, it's like, this is like the perfect excuse to even go further. I don't know. I'm not conspiracy either, but I think we have to be, I don't know, aware of it. Yeah,
if you watch Naomi Klein's The Shock Doctrine, she kind of talks about this a little bit, which is where there are specific groups of some government officials, some activists, and they essentially wait around for a crisis. And every time they wait around for the crisis, they always prescribe the same solution. Which is, she really specifically talks about, like, the Chicago school and Argentina after the election of Salvador Allende, and then the subsequent military coup that put Augusto Pinochet into power. Or I'm sorry, did I say Argentina?
Yeah, well, Chile. You know about it, Jay, or not at all?
The Naomi Klein stuff?
No. What was the name of the economist? The Chicago Boys?
The Chicago Boys. It's Milton Friedman.
Oh yeah, it's Milton Friedman. He's gonna get you. You can just pass me on this, because if I end up talking about it, it's gonna just make fun of the whole thing. I think Tyler Cowen's line about Naomi Klein is right. Like, she apparently believes her own bullshit. Like, I think
can I say that
I honestly don't think it's of any intellectual interest at all. Like,
okay,
it's just complete.
I can just share my empiric evidence in living in Chile.
Yeah,
during dictatorship, because for me, I know maybe you're right. There are some characters that have a lot of the people make a caricature of them. Like, yeah, he's evil. I don't think Milton Friedman is evil. He was just believing that, free markets solve all problems. So what he did in Chile was, I don't know, was the perfect opportunity to test the theory. The best scenario to test the theory is like you have control of everything. And in Chile, everything is private. You know, there are no public services. You know, so well, I can just share my experience, but I'm lucky enough to know people from the different classes. You know, poor people, rich people in Chile, and this creates that Chile, it became one of the most developed countries in South America. Nothing can deny that. With a growth of 2% every year, amazing, a miracle. But it creates a huge gap between rich and poor.
Yeah. No, I'm not denying that
And-
the Chicago
and
boys had influence. I'm just
creates-
saying, like the Naomi's like, the Chicago people are waiting in the background and they're gonna get you.
Okay.
It's
Well,
just,
I don't think that was the point
it's
of
just
her
kind of
book.
nonsense. It's just I just don't
Okay,
take it seriously at
but
all.
I
I
can
mean,
just finish,
I don't think it's a good
my
idea
point.
to chalk up
Can I
anything.
just finish my idea? The thing is that this create a gap, and of course, it create a lot of, I don't know, technology and business and whatever you want, economic growth, but a lot of delinquency, violence, because when you have that huge gap between rich and poor, it creates a lot of problems. There's a lot of science that can tell you that, because it create there's no connection, there's no empathy. You know, the the poor hate the rich hate the poor, and it is crazy. And I was lucky enough to be friends with poor people, rich people, but it was like two different worlds. And it's crazy, and it shocked me when I live in France since will be around 8 years now, and it's a completely different system. And you can see that, yeah, of course, there's this violence, there is delinquency, everything you want, but it's less, way less than in Chile. And the thing is, just because of that, because these people learn that you have to invest your money in people, you know, with good education, with healthcare, you know, don't let people starve so they don't kill you in the street because they are looking for food. You know, I know maybe this is shocking for you, but or maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. I'm not, you know, like you were saying that I think I have all the answers, but I can tell you that it's a huge difference. And especially during this crisis, you know, the measures that they are taking in Chile is awful. You know, it's like we cannot stop the economy, you know, but and they kind of they impose a lockdown, but only in the rich area, you know, just to protect the. No, it's crazy, man. Yeah. But wait. Okay.
Well, I mean, so
I
don't think that Milton Friedman was a villain in the sense that he's sitting there plotting how he can make the world a worse place. In fact, I think he was trying to make the world a better place. Similarly with the Chicago boys. But at the same time, you know, we can't deny like the existence of Operation Condor. The United States put into place to prevent socialism from spreading in South America. Like that's boom, 100% there. We know that Pinochet was backed by the United States. He was backed by the CIA. We know that the Chicago boys were part of a plan by the government to go down there, and maybe they thought they were really helping. In fact, I think that's probably more likely because nobody likes to think of themselves as a villain, and I don't think it's a good idea to ever chalk up to malice what can be more easily chalked up to incompetence. But, you know, I mean, the fact is they did put Pinochet in power, and he did like torture and disappear thousands and thousands of people. in order to impose this system that was supposedly everybody wants. I think also a lot of the time you talk about like who you have to lose, your grandmother or the person in the other world because of the economy. I feel like a lot of the time the people who are in power and making the decisions, they're making decisions based upon their immediate social circle and the people that they know that will be impacted. And so when they make these very large, very sweeping economic decisions, what happens is their first loyalty is to their primary constituents. It's to the rich people that fund their campaigns. It's to the other senators and the other people in that community. And the rest of us just become an abstraction.
Jay, please.
Well, I like talking about the poor quite a bit, and this is actually, one of the things I'm worried about when it comes to the issue of social democracy. So right now, I'm writing a debate book with the philosopher Dick Arneson called Debating Capitalism. And we're not debating capitalism for and against. We're both saying, like, look, for the most part, capitalist economies, when there's no pure capitalist economies out there, but the capitalist economies are functioning better overall than the non-capitalist economies. We can talk about ideal systems or so on, but we're not doing that. We just want to know which form of capitalism is best. And my book ends up being an extended critique of social democracy, like you see in France, like you see in Sweden, like you see in the US, because I see this system, the thing that you're praising right now, and it's very good for the people who live there, but it's only good for the people who live there. What a social democracy is, like what it is in the United States to have a social democracy, is a system in which people who range from the top 1% of income worldwide to the top 15% of income worldwide, like engage in a degree of social insurance and mutual transfer and provision of public goods for one another. And to maintain that system, in order to make sure that we have the right kinds of tax receipts and that we can afford to give everyone a certain level of welfare, what you're finding is we're excluding immigrants from elsewhere. We're not letting them move here. We're not letting them trade in various ways. There's a lot of restriction outside. And so a lot of what the book is arguing is insofar, and it's not a complete choice, but insofar as we have to choose between an open borders political system where people can move freely between economies, or if we have to choose between redistribution within social democracies, from a left-wing point of view, the open border system is far superior. Like, it will clearly have massive welfare benefits for the people who are in genuine poverty. And actually, the evidence says that it won't actually have negative welfare benefits for the overwhelming majority of rich people living in these countries. But it is important that we recognize that when we're talking about the modern social democracies, we're talking about economic systems where the people that we call poor are in the top 15 to 20% of income earners. And a lot of the measures that we're taking right now to lock down on the economy, it might very well be and then redistribute wealth among us. That might very well be beneficial for all these rich people living in, France and living in Sweden, living in the United States. But it has pretty serious effects on genuinely poor people outside of our country.
I really don't know what you're talking about. because the reality here in France is nothing like you were describing. The poor.
In France, if anyone wants to move to France to take a job, they're allowed to do that.
What?
Like if I'm an Egyptian and I just feel like moving to France, I'm just allowed to do that.
Okay. You talk about open borders.
Immigration, that's the issue. So I think social democracies are really, like, when you talk about the equality that we create, it's like you're creating equality among a bunch of strangers who see themselves as sharing a nationality, which is largely a myth anyways. And then they're redistributing income and welfare among them. But the effect of having that is, in order to maintain that kind of social cohesion and that degree of redistribution, you're keeping out outsiders. And then when you actually look at the overall effect of that on inequality worldwide rather than inequality within a system, is a massive increase in the total amount of inequality within the world. So I'm bringing this up because you were complaining about the issues of inequality, and I agree that inequality within a particular social system tends to cause various kinds of social problems. But in order to reduce inequality inside of nation states, we take measures which increase inequality among all people on an absolute scale worldwide. And it's not just inequality, because I admit I don't really care about inequality for its own sake. It's poverty, genuine poverty. So I think, there's a lot to be said for how well social democracies are handling this problem, but there's also all these invisible costs, which if you have left-wing values, you should be worried about.
Yeah. I mean, I'll agree with you on the sense of open borders. I think that that's a very good idea. What is it? It'd be like $7 trillion richer if we had open borders.
The median estimate in the economics, the mean estimate in the economics literature is that open borders reduces world product by half. So $120 trillion.
120. Wow. Okay.
Yeah, and that's on certain optimistic assumptions, which probably are not true about when people will move. So on the more conservative estimate based upon behavioral studies is more like 60 trillion.
Yeah. I mean, I don't have a problem with open borders. I think that's a great idea. And I also think there's no real ethical reason you should ever restrict the free movement of peaceful people. Nation states and borders, these are all mental fiction. So I'm 100% in your corner there. Though what I will also say is we do need to be really careful when we look at poverty. So poverty, essentially, there's two aspects to it. As you said, like there's absolute poverty, there's the lack of stuff, of the things that you need. But also the issue then becomes essentially you have the relative poverty. And it's the relative poverty of somebody whose labor has been so heavily devalued that a billionaire can command it for almost nothing coming from that billionaire. I always talked about, ANCAPs will say stuff like, oh, we need to make everyone equally rich. And I will point out that if everyone in the world was a billionaire, if everyone was equally wealthy, being a billionaire wouldn't matter much. How much would you have to pay Michael Bloomberg to be a waiter at your next function? Or how much would you have to pay Bill Gates to come by and get a virus out of your computer? The fact is that I think it's important that we keep people out of absolute poverty where they can't get the things that they need, but also at the same time, the hierarchy that is created by bestowing a huge amount of money on a person or a ridiculous amount of property on them is incredibly self-destructive. Similarly, like I think one of the countries I can point to actually was what was Pol Pot? What country was that? Cambodia. So Cambodia, before Pol Pot came to power, and it was ruled over by that nutso king who was considered possibly worse than Pol Pot, or at least seemed to be worse than Pol Pot early on. One of the things that Westerners did was they came into that country, and Cambodia was a country of Theravada Buddhists. They were farmers, and so when they introduced these new Western style of farming to them, they found that at the time they worked 6 months out of the year, and then they had 6 months out of the year off because of the way the harvest was. Well, the Westerners gave them the technology and said, okay, great, you can double your harvest. And so what they found was these peaceful Theravada Buddhists went about and only worked 3 months out of the year. And I think, they were making less money. They had more of a lack, but they clearly had a much happier society that even before Pol Pot, once there really came the introduction of capitalism to that system, capitalism and money, and suddenly accumulating things was no longer a negative thing as it was for these Buddhists. You had gangs of people tearing babies in half for fun, and that's before Pol Pot and before the Vietnamese communists came in and stopped him. So, the introduction of more things and more wealth is not necessarily a good thing. And similarly, the presence of wealth in a society, especially when the wealth is unequally distributed between a few members of the society and a large underclass, again, you may look good on paper, but you are damaging the happiness and the quality of life of millions for a couple of elites.
Yeah, I'm not sure that's true. I think if this is like a testable hypothesis, and social scientists work on this. We don't just speculate or tell a story and here's something that happened once. So here's a good paper for people to read if you want to see about the connection between wealth and happiness. It's called Reassessing the Easterlin Paradox. It's by Betsy Stevenson and Justin Wolfers. Google that. You can get the paper for free. And one thing that they did was they surveyed something like 130,000 people. They got a random subsection, a proper representative but randomly allocated subsection of about, I think it was 96 different countries or 110 different countries. It was one of the biggest surveys ever done. And they did a number of questions asking people about their level of happiness, their level of life satisfaction, and so on. And then they wanted to find out, how does income inequality affect this? How does absolute levels of wealth affect it, and so on? And the surprising result, this was such a big paper, it overturned decades of research. Because prior to this paper, people tended to think, money works like this. As you get more money, you get happier up until you make about $12,000 a year in current US dollars, and then it plateaus. And then all that matters is if you make more money than your neighbors. So you're happier if you're richer than your neighbors. You're less happy if you're less rich.
Because you're playing a social game.
Yeah, but the absolute level of money doesn't matter. And what they actually found was, no, worldwide, money is very strongly correlated with happiness. The United States actually is an outlier in that Americans are unusually resistant to the effect of money on their happiness. The French, on the other hand, I always put my students this, they're much more affected by money than Americans are. US and Japan were outliers. And income inequality is not having this kind of, it does have negative effects, but it's not destroying the effect of money on happiness. It's still there. And further, that increased money around the world is correlated with things like a feeling of respect, a feeling of love, like how do you feel like your relationship is loving, and so on, and all these other kinds of positive benefits. So that's not to say that money is the be all and end all and that it fixes everything, but that's what the research says. And the other thing is that there is a problem with the way this research is done, in that we can't, if we want to know something like, how does exposure to how does exposure to lead paint affect height? Well, we can look for natural experiments and actually measure how tall people are. We want to measure how happy people are. We have to basically ask them, like, to rate yourself and try to train them to use language in a certain way. But you'd probably expect that, if anything, people will tend to tailor their use of language to their experiences. So if you're living in a society where, like, there's a lot of infant death and a lot of actual, like, physical suffering and mental suffering and very few opportunities, nevertheless, what people will say when you're like, how happy are you? They'll probably look around and go, I guess I'm above average, so maybe I'm like a 6, and then you ask the same question in a rich society where people have tremendous opportunity and eat wonderful foods and can do whatever they want, and even their work is mostly leisurely, like, and all of that, and you ask them, how happy are you? They look around and go, yeah, I'm about average. So I suspect that, if anything, the bias in the way that the things are tested understate the differences, but
I mean, humans, what was it? Some of the people in London were the happiest during the Blitz. Difficult times are actually extremely interesting to humans. And so oftentimes it is specifically engaging with and overcoming difficult obstacles that we find exceptionally fulfilling. So it doesn't surprise me that somebody facing greater challenges might be happier. And also that, again, happiness is sort of a game where you're constantly chasing a thing that I don't actually think is generated by your circumstances. It can certainly affect it in the short term, but in the long run, the ability to feel happiness, the ability to feel like you have what you have, the overall contentment, that it's an internal thing as opposed to an external thing. But at the same time, once again, when you incentivize things, when you turn over a culture that has existed the way that it has for thousands and thousands of years, you do get some horrific inhuman practices, like, for instance, the gangs of people in Cambodia tearing apart babies and stuff.
Yeah, I can just say something, because your point is really interesting, Jay. I'm just want to know how your story, how you arrived to have that kind of, I don't know, point of view, your I don't know, your history a little, because I think it's really interesting.
Well, I mean, with any of these things, it's not like there's a big story behind it. It's just if you have a hypothesis, you have to do proper social science.
No. I'm talking about you personally. Like, when you were young, you already were questioning the state, or
okay?
Yeah, he's asking about your political journey, I think.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right. How to put it? I guess I've always been disagreeable, open-minded, and disagreeable. Two characters.
You ever was like leaning left or more leaning right, or?
I think when I was really young, I didn't have the proper labels for a lot of the stuff that I was thinking. But for me, it was just like my intellectual journey is almost like this. I think in ninth grade in particular, I had a teacher who pushed the idea that big ideas drive history. She didn't prove that. There's not actually good evidence for that. I think she's probably wrong now. But nevertheless, she pushed that idea, and being a ninth grader didn't know much better. I'm like, well, if that's interesting, then maybe that's true. Maybe I should start studying these big ideas. So I remember I won this. I got this thing published in some student newspaper and or student magazine, and they gave you like book certificates. So I went and bought a bunch of stuff by Karl Marx and a bunch of stuff by John Locke, thinking these are two archetypes of like two different traditions that have been driving the world up until recently. You know, ninth grade for me, like the Soviet Union had fallen fairly recently, like about 4 years prior. So I'm like, let's sort of see that. And then I started reading more stuff and reading economics and reading more philosophy. And then I just kept doing that. So I think it started with Mrs. What's her name? Shostakovich. I don't know if I remember her name properly. Yeah, she was saying something like yeah, it's like the composer saying something like ideas drive history, and I'm like, if they do, I better understand these ideas. Even though now that I've sort of seen more of the social science, I'm not so sure that ideas drive history. I think it's other stuff.
I'd be interested to ask you about something really quick, Jay. So one of the things that I've been interested in, this is outside of my wheelhouse, and it may be outside of your wheelhouse. So, feel free if you don't have an answer for this. But so essentially, a big argument that I have found, usually between the libertarians and I mean that the right libertarians and the kind of old left, like Soviet central planning approach to economies, seems to be an argument between expertise in the sense of central planning and markets in the sense of the more right libertarians, the more capitalist ideology. Now, what I found was really interesting recently is what's called swarm technology, where some scientists have created a way of aggregating individual input in such a way that it outperforms both markets and individual expertise on certain questions. Like what it was most famously recently used to do was to correctly predict the winner of the Kentucky Derby, beating both the Vegas odds markets and the experts on thinking which horse would win. So what I've been very interested in, and people will say this, they'll say like, well, how would you ideally structure our society? I've usually give the answer that I think we should look more strongly into swarm technology in how we make our economic decisions, rather than leaving it up necessarily to the capitalist class or to central planning from politicians. Now, one, are you familiar with this? And two, what are your thoughts on this? Have you encountered it before? And if so, how do you see it working?
Yeah, it's a good question. I haven't heard the phrase swarm technology, but I've heard of similar kinds of issues. So a sort of history of the debate about socialism. When people ask why doesn't socialism work, there's two basic kinds of answers they give. One's a motivational problem. People are assholes and they don't make it work because they're such assholes. That's an interesting question on its own. But then the other bigger thing that's more important from an economist perspective is information. So back in the 1920s, and then from that, a number of economists started arguing that socialism doesn't work on a large scale. It works on a small scale, but not on a large scale because of an information problem that central planners face. You need, in order to make a proper economic decision, an efficient economic decision, you need to know lots of local information about local opportunities, local wants, local trade-offs, like the kinds of trade-offs that you would make. And you need something that communicates that to whoever makes the decisions. So then basic economic theory tells you that when you have a market and people are making decisions en masse about the small things they have access and control over, this leads to these two emergent phenomena, the supply and demand curve, and to an emergent market price, which reflects people's disparate knowledge and so on. It has this informational role, and then how good it is depends upon the functioning of the market. The more competitive the market, the better it is. The less competitive, the less good
it is.
Yeah. So that's the thought. And then when people are arguing this back in like the mid 20th century, once computer technology started appearing, people kept saying, aha, well, now what we'll be able to do is overcome the information constraint of socialism through computer programs. And you can actually see Salvador Allende had this like computer like lab kind of, it was fake, but Yeah, and so ever since then, people have speculated. Yeah, that over time.
Called CyberC.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So people have been speculating over time that eventually we'll be able to come up with some sort of computer algorithms with sufficiently good computers that are constantly measuring lots and lots of things that they could outperform even markets. And the answer is like, oh, in principle, that's certainly true. In principle, you can imagine a coherent sci-fi story where that happens, but can we go from this computer is very good at predicting which person is going to win the Kentucky Derby to it can make, trillions and trillions of decisions about economic issues per second with all this local data that it would need? Maybe, and when it happens, then that'll be an argument again for a new kind of economic system, right? Have the computer is the philosopher queen, but until I actually see it, it's like, yeah, maybe. But it's kind of like saying
like an RBE. I don't know if you know, a resource-based economy. You never heard that term?
I don't think so. What does that mean?
Okay, you never heard about the Venus Project?
The Venus Project?
Yeah.
No, I guess not.
It's not from the planet Venus. Well, I will let you a link so you can say, because actually we're a little what you were talking about, but it's like sci-fi. I don't know. I think we are too. We need to go so advance a little more step to get there.
Well,
we're still debating if
yeah. Be careful with the Venus Project is what I'll say. I agree. We need a few more steps, and it's from what I've seen of it, like the people who are into it are really into it. I just always remember that the guy behind the Venus Project is the same guy behind that Zeitgeist film with like the government did 9/11 and
no.
Jesus was for us and all this weird shit.
It's not that at all.
Yeah. I did 9/11. That's the actual thing. Like, yes.
Say what?
Just for the record, for the conspiracy theorists, I did 9/11. I want to get it.
I knew it.
I framed those other assholes. Right.
Actually, I remember because I don't know. For me, it's great to talk to you for the first time because I think I'd add you on Facebook many years ago. And one thing that really found interesting about you, Jay, was like I talk with a lot of libertarians, anarcho-capitalists, and bunch of them are kind of extreme in their views, if you can say it like that. And you were kind of, I don't know, more reasonable. And I don't know if I remember correctly, it was like Heart Bleed Libertarians, something like that.
Yeah, Bleeding Heart Libertarians. That's our mutual blog. It's somewhat defunct. We barely ever write on it anymore.
But it still exists, or?
Yeah, it still exists. There's not as much on there recently. I've written some stuff about the things we were talking about with regard to COVID. But yeah, Bleeding Heart Libertarians is all about reconciling the idea of like being in favor of social justice and being in favor of markets. What does that mean? And why these things can go together. And also, well, part of what we were trying to argue is that the actual history of classical liberal or libertarian thought was always welfarist and social justice oriented, even though the language of social justice is new. So it's anachronistic it's anachronistic, though correct, to say that that's what they were after. They just didn't use those terms. And that the kind of libertarianism you see among certain ANCAPs, which is, these are our rights, damn it, though the sky fall, and it doesn't matter if people die or starve, is sort of an aberration that's not actually, that's like, even though it's in many cases the face of an ideology, it's actually not the central part of the ideology. It's an aberration. And you can talk about, there's a certain intellectual history to why they made those kinds of arguments, but I think it's largely a mistake. So yeah, I get a lot of flack.
There's also a monetary history as to why they made that. I mean, a lot of Koch money has gotten shuffled through the university system, and you can even go back. There's a great essay I recommend you guys look up. It's called like Fools, Finks, and FBI Stooges, where it traces the creation of the modern American libertarian to like Jerry Rubin and Richard Fink and Charles Koch. Whereas, as you're pointing out, like liberal tradition has had in it, like, equality, fraternity, liberty, equality, fraternity. And that seems to be what the Bleeding Heart Libertarians are trying to bring about, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, I think that's right. I'm probably not so good on the fraternity stuff because, as I said, I'm very disagreeable and I don't really like other people, but or people in general. But yeah, I think that's all part of it. That said, though, we should be careful because, like, when you think about the kind of radical ANCAPs that are all over the internet, they're not people who are really part of the university system per se. I mean, Murray Rothbard did have a job at like the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, but he wasn't someone who was like having a lot of influence in the academy. He wasn't like publishing in the major journals or anything like that. The other kinds of people that are sort of associated with that movement are generally outsiders to academia. They're far outside the mainstream, which, I think that's part of why I was often I'm very critical of Murray Rothbard. I don't think his philosophical work is good.
I agree.
And I'm critical of like, who's the other person they love? Hans Hermann.
Oh, and yeah, Hans Hermann Hoppe.
Yeah, Hans Hermann Hoppe. I don't think his work is good. I think it's actually based, like, his most famous argument, I think, is based upon an elementary mistake. And so I've often gotten a lot of flack from certain libertarians for going after them because those are their heroes. And I'm like, pick better heroes. They're not doing good work. But there's this weird cultish thing that goes along where it's like, this is our hero, and people criticize them because they're jealous of their stature. It's like, who's or they're criticizing them because they've been brainwashed into doing that. And I'm like, yeah, I don't know. I think wanting Murray Rothbard to meet basic philosophical standards is not brainwashing.
Yeah.
It's just...
No, it happened. That's why I invite you, because I already talked with many ANCAPs and libertarians, and for me, you were the more reasonable one.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah, well, it's funny because I will usually say this to like libertarians and ANCAPs. I'll be like, look, if you guys are interested in economics, like, go to college, learn economics, like actually learn it. Don't just say, do you prax, bro? So you seem to be the libertarian who actually went to college and did the rigorous stuff. So hats off to you for that.
Yeah, well, thanks. Well, that's part of the thing. They're always like, what's your favorite thing about Austrian economics? I'm like, I think there are insights from the Austrian economists. I think they've largely been brought into mainstream neoclassical economics. But, when you take a class with me at Georgetown and we cover econ, we're covering mainstream econ. We're not reading. I don't have a problem with von Mises, but we're not going to read what's his book, Human Action or something. We're going to talk. Yeah, we're going to talk about the regular kinds of papers you would talk about in any other class.
Yeah, because for me, that kind of ideas are kind of, I don't know, old. I don't know. Human Action was written, but
1930s, I think.
Yeah, we live in a different world now. We have a different technology. We interact on way different. Look, right now, Mises didn't knew that we will have the internet and we were gonna connect each other from different countries. And
Jay, at some point, I'll have to send you my criticism of praxeology, because I'd be interested to see, like, you're actually educated in this field. This was me thinking about it, but I think I found a way to disprove the first axiom. So I'll send that over to you. It's fun. It involves zombies.
Yeah, Brian Kaplan, my friend Brian Kaplan, is a famous response to Austrians called like "Why I'm Not an Austrian Economist," which has some critiques of it. But it's not that I want to say at the same time. I don't think I think there's a lot of value from studying the history of economics. I think every academic field has a problem where it gets fixated on certain models or certain new idea, idée fixe or whatever, like something that's popular now and oftentimes there were insights in the past that they've forgotten. So there's value to studying the history of economics. There's value in studying the history of philosophy or the history of sociology. But I'm suspicious of people that don't want to do any of that. But I'm also suspicious of people that are just like, this guy figured it out in 1920. Like, that's the final word. When it's like, no, because there's all this stuff that we definitely figured out since then that person didn't know about. And it's like the theory of why do firms exist? What's the economic theory that explains the existence of firms rather than why everyone is just like being on a private contractor on the open market? Like, why do I work for a corporation like Georgetown rather than just selling philosophy and econ, like PPE services independently? It's like Mises wrote his books before we knew that. So presumably, that's just one of thousands of advances he didn't know about. So you certainly can't end with Mises. Even if he's worth reading, you don't end there.
Oh, that's so refreshing hearing that.
Yeah, well, we've spent entirely too much time arguing with weirdos on the internet. So I do have a question, though, for you, because I want to know if you're the kind of libertarian that argues this or not. And, you hear from a lot of them the idea that price gouging is good. And that we should allow people, for instance, a hurricane hits, people need water. So what we need to do is make sure that there's a guy down there selling water for $70 a bottle or something. Like, what's your opinion on that?
Yeah, I think look up what Mike Munger has said about this recently. Mike Munger, who's an economist at Duke, I think he's basically right. There are going to be special circumstances when you have a crisis hit. You want to do a few things. One is if something is suddenly scarce, you want to have people treat it as scarce. Another thing is if there's a possibility of incentivizing people to leave it for the next person, you want to do that. It's kind of the same thing. A third thing is if there's a way of incentivizing people from the outside of bringing in new resources, then you want to do that. So in general, if you think about what happens during, say, a crisis, like the market price rises. It's not even a question of what the law is. It just does, right? You have a supply and demand curve. Suddenly there's a crisis. So I'm gonna like mess this up because I'm trying to do it from your perspective, and I think I'm mirrored. But you have a supply shock, and that suddenly it's much harder to get things, and so therefore I have to do the other way. So therefore, like the supply curve is going to shift like that. You're going to have an issue about demand will suddenly rise for certain products. It'll fall for some products, but rise for others. And so you're going to have that. So the market price rises. And if you don't let the market price get to that point, there will be a shortage. So there will be a scarcity issue, and people are going to have to find one way of getting it or another. They might have to line up. They might buy it and auction it and so on. Now, there can be special circumstances where allowing the market price to rise is not going to be efficient, but they're pretty uncommon. So yeah, I think price gouging is a loaded term. It should be called scarcity pricing.
Yeah, but I mean, like with so this has been my criticism of this type of thinking, and more or less it's the idea that you incentivize some of the worst actors in society to go and try to bring their resources to this area. The kind of guy who's going to see a hurricane hit and think, I can make a bunch of money really fast with almost no and go down there and, sell the water for $70, $100 a bottle. I don't know if that's really a guy you want around in a crisis causing havoc, essentially.
But hold on though. So there's a question about people's motivation. Like suppose it turns out, I'm a medical doctor and every day I go and I save lives. I'm really good at it. I save like 15 lives per day. And it turns out the only reason I'm willing to save lives is because I want to like impress my girlfriend so she'll sleep with me. Well, you're a sociopathic asshole. You have bad character, but you're nevertheless saving lots of lives. We're taking what basically the social structure has done is taking a sociopathic asshole like you and directed you towards public ends. And you might not share those ends, you might not care about them, but you're nevertheless doing something good. So
yeah, I mean,
this guy is an asshole, and it's like, what is he doing with his asshole behavior? You've incentivized him to go remove a problem people have, and then when he does that and other people see he's making money, they might do it too. On the other hand, there's the issue that I have where it's like, we're like, that guy, he just wants to make money. So he bought all this stuff and he brought it down there and he now people have the thing that they want. Whereas me, I sit around doing nothing and I'm like somehow better than he is doing nothing. So his actions, I think the quality of his action is making the world a better place. And my judging him is just me feeling good about myself. It's a kind of moral masturbation I engage in order to like flaunt my superiority.
For me, that's great because there's a lot of great and crazy at the same time, because a lot of times libertarians and anarcho-caps so this kind of situation like just numbers, like you have the amount of lives, and it's crazy because for me one thing that is really relevant is context. In every example that sometimes these people gave me, like, I don't know, like you right now, it's like there's no context. There's this guy do this, and this happened, and this their motivation, and that's so. Yeah. I don't know. It's like happening in a vacuum, Like,
Well, it's a thought
I can
experiment, you're
say
saying.
what
Yeah.
happened if his girlfriend leave him. You know,
Yeah.
all the people die. It's like what?
I
It's
mean,
kind
sort
of
of.
a crazy
Yeah.
example. I don't
Oh,
know.
Well, the
no,
point of these things is to specify, use thought experiments in physics or economics or philosophy to specify if these are the parameters, what we'd expect to happen, what we say about them. And then when you apply it to the real world, of course, that's when the context matters. You have to ask, well, maybe the facts are different than what you specified.
Yeah. Because no, I get what you're saying there. I mean, the thing is that I sort of feel like like as Ivan mentioned, and as I have kind of framed this whole thing, the issue is the idea. It's like the myth of the anti-hero. It's the idea that we can take the worst aspects of human nature and bend them to socially beneficial ends. And I don't think we can do that. I mean, maybe possibly in the extremely short term, but not in the long term. Because also, as people perform these actions and as they make a bunch of money, they gain a bunch of power as a result of that. And if you reward a person who is essentially a selfish asshole only doing it for his girlfriend with lots of money and lots of power, well, what's going to happen then is that individual can hurt a lot more people further on down the line, specifically because he was able to do that.
Well,
It's like Bill Cosby.
What do you say?
Sorry.
Well, what power is he getting? If you're you know, what power is he getting? I don't understand that. Maybe you're saying power in a very broad way. Like if you have a salary, suppose I have a salary. I'm in the top 1% of American income earners. So how much power do I have? Like I wish I had some power because I would totally use it for certain ends. But it's like, what do I have? I can spend more money than some other people can on certain things. I have some influence on some students sometimes. So if I try to use it in certain ways, I'll just get in a little, like if I'm like, you have to agree with me or I'll punish you, I'll just get in trouble. Like,
I mean, I was thinking more like take a Michael Bloomberg type person, but in the case of a doctor,
what you did though, you went from like, okay, a couple kids, like, think of like the college kids they weren't even college kids, like these guys from like South Carolina who like bought a bunch of ice and brought it up to another state, and they made a few $1,000s before they got hauled off to jail, to a medical doctor making a few $100,000 a year, to a billionaire, Michael Bloomberg, with billions. Even Bill Gates, it's like, how much, Bill Gates does have certain kinds of power, but like, let's be clear, like, I'm using a Mac right now. I'm not even using his products. Like, I'm using the products that I prefer. Even that guy doesn't have that much power over me, though he has more influence in the world than I do.
Yeah,
that's why I think context is important. Mm-hmm. The context is important because, for example, right now with this pandemic, there's I don't know, in your commune that you live, there's one guy that have access to the, I don't know, the vaccine that will cure the stuff, and I don't know, is the only one who can have it. There's no other way, so he had power over you, even if you have the money to buy it, at the end he can choose increase the price or not selling it to you.
Yeah, monopolies. Everyone agrees monopolies are bad. But what does that prove? Monopolies are bad. Don't have monopolies. Right?
Well,
on this point, like David Ricardo had a point about this. Like he was talking about exploitation back in his 1815 book, or his 1816 Principles of Political Economy, where he came up with the idea of comparative advantage and so on. He says, imagine you have a farmer, and this person is on the verge of starvation. He's a laborer. He's on the verge of starvation. And let's just, for the sake of argument, say that his reservation price is $1. If he makes less than $1, he's not willing to work that day. He'll just he'll just starve to death that day. If he makes at least $1, though, he was willing to work, and that'll be enough to keep him fed. Suppose his efficiency is enough that he's able to do up to $10 worth of work for other people. Like if you hire him on your farm, he'll produce $10 worth of value for you. Now, suppose he comes up to me and asks me, can I work for you? And I know his situation, and I'm just a sociopath. I don't care about his life at all. I just want to make as much money for myself as I can. Well, I'm going to offer him like $1 or $1.01 to take the job because I'll have much more bargaining power than he does. He'll actually benefit from taking the job more than I do. His life sustains, and I just get $9 of profit. But I'll have all the bargaining power if there's just one of us because of his desperation. But Ricardo says, imagine, so this is an example of monopsony buyer rather than monopoly provider. A monopsony buyer can exert all this power. But then Ricardo says, imagine that instead of there being one person who can buy his labor, there's 50, and he's still the only one who works. So in this case, it might be the kind of thing, and we're all still sociopaths. We just want to maximize our profit. We don't care about this person at all. We see him purely as a means to an end of getting more money for ourselves. So what happens? Well, I offer him $1, and then you, being a sociopath who wants to maximize your profit, offer him $1.01 because you can still make $8.99. And then you, another sociopath, offer him $1.02. And then we keep bidding up against each other. And then it turns out he actually has, in this situation where he's the only provider of the labor and there's 50 of us bidding against him, even though he's desperate for work and none of us are desperate for his effort, he has all the bargaining power and we end up paying him about $10. So Ricardo's point here is, like, yeah, it really sucks when you have only one provider of a service or only one buyer of a service. But the fun thing about competition, this is why we like markets, market competition eliminates power. The solution to a person having a concentration power is competition. And this is what Adam Smith says about this too. It's like, why is it capital? He didn't use the word capitalist, but why is it capitalists are so against capitalism? Why is it that he's like, you get two capitalists together and they immediately conspire to change the laws to make it so that he's like, it's because capitalism is a profit destroying machine. What capitalism does is it rewards you if you come up with a new innovation or a new idea or a new mechanism. Like you come up with the idea of, the Chipotle style restaurant. You come up with the idea of the sports sedan like BMW does. You come up with this, but then it allows everyone else to copy it and they compete against you and they drive your profits away. And so capitalists are constantly trying to prevent this sort of competition. So if you hate power, if you don't want there to be a concentration of power in one person or another, one thing you want to do, of course, is try to make sure you have a very competitive market. By definition, and in actual practice as well, competitive markets are power destroying machines. So yes, you can imagine a scenario. You can always imagine this happens and this happens. But the question then is, what does that mean in the real world? In the real world, what it means is, like, if you're going to have any kind of market system, you want it to be as competitive as possible. But I'm not
going to disagree with you on that. But the problem is that that's not how this plays out in reality. I mean, first of all, you've got. Okay, so first of all, the fact is that it's never just one person with more employers bidding on him. That's the problem right there. The lower class and the less skilled workers always vastly outnumber the capitalist class, and capitalism can't actually function at all in a situation where labor is 1/10 and employers are 9/10. That's one of the reasons why we're working in corporations and we're not working for each other. So, in theory, sure. And then the second issue is
wait, hold on. Let me ask you a question. The Coase's economic theory of the firm. Can you recite it? Can you explain?
No, I certainly can't.
Okay,
that's not my wheelhouse. That's not where.
It just sounds to me like you're like. I think it's important that we be humble, and one of the things we want to make sure we do is like, don't speculate about the economic theory behind the existence of this and that when you haven't been exposed to. Like, I'm not going to
speculate. That seems to be an obvious. That seems to be an obvious.
No, you said, like, why are we working for firms? What explains that? Right?
Well, yeah.
There's a very famous paper called "The Economic Theory of the Firm." It's by Coase. It's published in 1937. That is the dominant explanation of like why we work at firms.
And I'm not saying that explanation is incorrect, and I need to go back and read it. But also, it's very obvious that you need a smaller capitalist class than a labor force.
Why is that obvious?
Because of exactly what you said. When you get into a situation where you have more capitalists than labor, where you have more people offering a job than needing a job, you get to a point where it's impossible to actually make a profit on the job. Because you said eventually that guy's going to get up to being offered $10 when he was producing $10 worth of value.
I mean, you can have a system in which you just have lots and lots of petty bourgeoisie, small providers. We're all capitalists because we own our own businesses and we trade in mass. That's possible. It's existed in history at various times where you haven't had lots of people working for corporations or for firms, and you can have lots of just private farmers and so on. That's perfectly coherent.
I mean, I don't think you can do that in a modern economy, but anyway.
Yeah, and the reason we don't in a modern economy is transaction costs.
Mm-hmm. That's the actually doing business.
Yeah, so read the 1937 paper. That's why firms exist.
I mean, I can read that paper, but
transaction costs.
yeah. So my point is, though, is that the example you gave is something that can't actually exist in reality.
Which example?
The example of the 10 employers with the one worker.
No, it wasn't saying it was existing in reality. The point was to illustrate that, like, when you think about what happens in markets, when people want to criticize markets, they do this really silly thing, even though it was refuted before Marx was writing, where it's like, let me have you imagine a monopoly provider or a monopsony provider, and then I'm going to analyze it with old-fashioned tools about how I think monopolies work, which were refuted in the 1890s, where it's like, actually, you don't even understand efficiency, wages, and other things, but you have an old-fashioned analysis of monopsony or monopoly. You go, wouldn't that suck? Therefore, markets are bad. And it's like,
I mean, I'm not going to tell you.
It's actually like, well, what are actual markets like? How competitive are they? Because the point of that example is to show competition dominates over desperation. Competition dominates over power. So to criticize a market by saying, imagine a circumstance where someone has this power and they do this, it's not very interesting. What you want to know is like, well, how competitive are actual markets? And also, what are the things that are impeding them from being competitive? And one of the biggest findings in the second half of the 20th century was oftentimes the laws are written to make the markets less competitive on behalf of various corporations.
The laws are
process called rent seeking, and the very regulatory state which is put in place supposedly to constrain corporations, gets captured by corporations to reinforce their market power.
Yeah, so I don't disagree with you. I just don't think there's any other way that a capitalist economy can get to that point. Like, if you are a capitalist and you get to a point where you have enough money to pay politicians to rewrite the laws to put out the propaganda that you want to put out, well, you're a freaking idiot if you don't go buy yourself a mayor or a senator or a president. And in fact,
you're getting that wrong. So you're getting that wrong too, because if you actually study the phenomenon of rent seeking and look at the empirics behind it, it's not the rich engage in rent seeking and the poor don't. That's not the thing that explains it. It's actually about differential benefits. It's when there's a possibility of what are called concentrated benefits and diffuse costs, which is going to be a case-by-case basis. Those people who have the concentrated benefits engage in rent seeking. Sometimes they're poor, sometimes they're rich. It has nothing to do with the income inequality. Even in a world where everyone had the same amount of money, if you started with that, the phenomenon of concentrated benefits and diffuse costs would lead to rent seeking over time. So I think you're not describing the phenomenon the right way.
I wouldn't disagree with the fact that people seek rent, like, that poor people might go to seek rent or rich people might go to seek rent. But the fact is that success within the capitalist marketplace makes it more likely that you will be able to seek rent and seek rent successfully when you do. And then second of all, you talk about monopoly. And
here's an idea then. All right, you think if some people have a lot of money, they might buy something bad with it. So one thing to do is forbid having a lot of money, and the other thing to do is take away the opportunity to do the bad thing. Right? I mean, if people let's take something really awful, child pornography. People who have more money are going to be more able to get that than people who don't. We don't react to that by going, aha, we need to forbid differences in income. We react to that by going, we need to get rid of the child pornography. We need to police that. We need to go after those markets. So similarly, with regard to power and the exercise of power through rent seeking and so on, you might think maybe richer people are more able to engage in rent seeking than poorer people. One solution is to get rid of rich people, and the other solution is to get rid of the conditions that enable rent seeking, like the power that's there in the first place. And as an anarchist, I would think you'd be all in favor of that, because the economic systems that you have in France, for example, enable a massive amount of rent seeking. There's an incredible amount of rent seeking. France is a rentier society. I mean, you're talking about it as being this close-knit, happy society of kumbaya, but it's also a society with massive amounts of predation through government welfare systems.
I mean, what I'm going to say is, so...
Really?
Yeah, the problem is that with
I'm gonna let you guys go finish it, but I really do have to split. But it's been really good talking to you guys, and it's been very interesting. It's been a fun debate. As I said, I'm disagreeable and not humble. So with that, I'll say to you bye and let you guys finish up, and I'll watch what you say in response later, even though I can't sit here for it right now.
Okay.
So have a good one.
All right. So can I finish what I was going to say really quickly?
What?
I do have to go. Yeah. All right. So what I was essentially saying is that the difference between like using the child pornography thing is, you know, if you're really successful at child pornography, you don't get to literally rewrite the rules. I mean, you look at what Noam Chomsky specifically talks about this, how every single developed society in history, once it has developed, has always gotten into a point where the winners of the development competition get the government to subsidize them and write the rules based around what they want to do. So, you know, and what I really wish I had been able to get out actually in the thing was also there's situations where you have what's called a natural monopoly. Railroads are a good example because you don't want a bunch of competing railroads on different railroad lines. You only need one or two railroad lines. Electricity, you know, utilities, internet. You don't want 5 different internet companies putting in their own cables. You know, you really only need one. You need a government to stop that. So I don't know what the hell he was talking about with regard to monopoly.
No, for me, it's funny because I'm sure it already happened to you talking with guys. But we can agree that Jay was pretty reasonable.
Oh yeah. He's probably one of the smarter libertarians I've ever talked to.
But these kind of crazy scenarios, it's like, imagine you have you're a king and you're in the space and you know, it's like this kind of impossible scenarios, and to explain something that would never happen, you know, it's like you know, for example, there are examples that there were more people. Of course, that's the ideal scenario. If there are more employers than employees, but
yeah. I'm kind of annoyed that he called it a debate, by the way, because I explicitly was like, "This is a discussion."
What?
Yeah,
I don't know if he say like that.
Yeah, if there was a debate going on, I'm certainly not engaging in one right now. But anyway, I do also have to go. So this has been really cool, and I'm glad I met the guy. I'm glad we're Facebook friends. He is definitely sharper than pretty much any other right-wing libertarian I've talked to. So I'm happy about that. You know, I do find the defense of price gouging, or however he wants to call it, unconscionable, and
yes,
you know, kind of pointing in a very bad direction precedence-wise when it's actually implemented. It's interesting. That's a Buddhist concept, by the way. It's called wrong view. It is sort of just like the idea of the brain flipping around something negative and making it into a positive. You know, and Americans are obsessed with it. It's why we have the anti-hero archetype. It's why the last Superman movie had Superman snapping a guy's neck and screaming. Like, people are very attracted to this idea of incentivizing the worst aspects of humanity and turning it to good ends. It's a very compelling idea. It's just not, it doesn't work out in reality, in my opinion.
Yeah, we can agree on that. So I really thank you, and no, it was really interesting.
Yeah, I can't believe I confused Argentina with Chile. By the way, I apologize. It's Naomi Klein. Her other movie is set in Argentina, so my brain just went whoop.
Yeah, no problem at all. So see you soon, maybe another time.
And tell your followers, if they can, to please subscribe to the channel.
Please tell about your channel.
Yeah, I'm on YouTube. The link should be in the description. I just started taking YouTube seriously, and so I've been doing debates and kind of talking about philosophy. The channel is mostly me kind of dipping my foot into it because I promised myself that I was only going to do YouTube so that it didn't take away from my writing. But, you know, it's a lot of fun. I engage with a lot of people, and there is a takedown of praxeology in there that involves zombies. So definitely check that out. And yeah, thanks very much.
Great.
I'll catch you guys later. Bye.
Bye.